Council stand in session. Should we try that again? Should we try that again? Okay, we're going to take out of order. We've got a lot of people here on item 3, so let's take that first. I'll call a general area neighborhood plan scheduled for 30 minutes. Councilmember Kozaczek has requested a discussion of general area and neighborhood plans as they relate to zoning. Councilmember Kozaczek. You're on. I could use them.
Okay. I have actually several points to make before I call Bonnie. Can't hear you. Turn.
Speak into the mic. There you go.
It's turned on. Okay, I have several points to make before we invite Bonnie Paulus up to speak. First of all, I read the TRRG material, as I'm sure all of us did, and also read the letter that the Chamber of Commerce sent out on Sunday evening. Somebody here from the Chamber, by the way? Negative? Oh, that's unfortunate. The conclusion that I draw from reading those is that they sound like two completely different worldviews. And the reality is that members of the Chamber all live in neighborhoods and really should be TRRG members. And there are TRRG members that I know who own small businesses, and they should join the Chamber. Instead, we have this us versus them, we, they mentality going on, this dichotomy. And my sense is that for us to be the best that we can, we need to bridge that divide and gain a mutual understanding of each other and the positions that we stand for. I was hoping that somebody from the Chamber would be here because my whole goal is to bring the parties together, and so I will reach out to, if Bonnie, if you're up for this, I'm offering to facilitate a meeting between each group, not each side, but each group, to bring everyone together and open that dialogue up. And if TRRG is up for that, I'll reach out to the Chamber, either Michael Guyman or Amber Smith, and see if we can get people in the same room to have that dialogue. I think that's important. Because we need to understand and look for common ground where we can find it without sacrificing our principles, but a totally unvarnished and open conversation, and let's just see where that leads us. And so if you're up for that, I'll reach out to Amber and Michael. With that, last year the city manager invited TRRG to do a deep dive into the existing neighborhood plans. They have done that. They took a temperature of several neighborhood associations. I think there were 45 or something like that involved in their meetings. Today is that report out. I'm not going to try and predict what the presentation will be, but my sense is that, first of all, the city registers neighborhoods, and we sign off on their neighborhood plans. Several recent rezonings have sent conflicting messages. We need to know when we leave here today, we need to get some clarity, and I think this will come from the city attorney, what general conformity means. What does advisory in nature only mean? We've seen that language in several of the recent decisions. The UDC states that development is to be in conformity and comply with neighborhood plans, and yet we routinely hear that the UDC trumps neighborhood plans, and that to me is an inconsistency that we need to sort through. When we did the Fry's rezoning or neighborhood plan amendment, we effectively amended the HNP plan through the rezoning process, and the neighbors out there in that neighborhood now feel as though they got screwed in that process. With the monastery, I've intentionally front-loaded the neighborhood plan amendment in order to try and avoid that, and now some neighbors are feeling is that the neighborhood plan should not have included some of the elements that we included up front. And with the Mountain View, we heard general conformity, but we continue to have the Phoenix litigation cited that says where the Phoenix City Council passed a neighborhood plan amendment that allowed a 500-foot tall structure, and their neighborhood plan had a 250-foot tall limit, that generally conformed with the neighborhood plan. And if we're going to allow by a factor of 2 differences between what's being built and what exists in neighborhood plans, then I guess the question is what value are they, if any? So my hope is that we walk out of here today having made clear where neighborhood plans stand as general planning documents, answering the questions of whether or not their design criteria are meaningful, or are we going to default to looking at them as advisory? What does general conformity mean? What is that as a design standard? We have several neighborhoods who are right now considering going through and amending their neighborhood plans, and I'm not sure that that's worth asking them to do that lift if our conclusion is 250 feet equals 500 feet equals general conformity, live with it and move on. In which case they're relatively meaningless. I don't believe that they are, but we need that clarity from the city manager, and so that when we walk out of here, the people in the room understand where they fall in that whole pecking order. So with that as a preface, I don't know if that even addresses what Bonnie's going to address, but Bonnie, come and give your presentation. Stay at the mic when you're done, because I'm sure people are going to have some questions for you.
Bonnie, I think we tried to communicate early on. We've given this matter 30 minutes. I think probably the substance of it's going to be getting the answers that Councilmember Kozaczek asked the manager and the attorney to answer, so that people can have clarity on that. What are you looking at in terms of a presentation?
10 minutes, and I've practiced it.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mayor and Council, for allowing us to address you today at this study session. I'm speaking to you today as chair of the Tucson Residents for Responsive Government, and on behalf of the neighborhood associations who participated in our initiative last year, Sustainable Neighborhoods Through Planning. We asked for this time because after 15 months with representatives from over 40 neighborhoods meeting about their plans, we realized that we needed direction and leadership from our elected officials before any progress can be made. My main job today is to convince you of the value of investing in strong neighborhoods and long-range collaborative planning for Tucson's future. Every one of us in this room is a neighbor. And our hope is that we can use that commonality to bridge the issues that divide us about the future growth of Tucson. The Neighborhood Plan Initiative that TRRG took on last year brought together representatives from over 40 registered neighborhood associations, all concerned about the future of their neighborhood and area plans. We learned a lot from those forums, and the biggest take-home message is that neighborhood planning is only one component of neighborhood associations and what they contribute to this city. Neighborhoods are essential for the interface between the city and its citizens. And we came to appreciate how integrated neighborhood associations are with the various departments in the city that rely on registered neighborhood associations to communicate with and elicit assistance from the public. And here are some good examples. The city clerk's office.
The city clerk relies on neighborhood association contacts for all liquor license notifications and feedback.
Environmental services.
Neighborhood associations are the main point of contact for brush and bogey plus implementation and for neighborhood cleanup events and dangerous and hazardous waste pickups.
Code enforcement.
Neighborhood
The police department.
Neighborhood associations are relied upon for promoting and organizing neighborhood watch and other programs for combating crime. Associations are the community unit allowed to receive victims' rights notifications in certain crimes. The neighborhood associations are an important point of contact for community-based policing efforts.
Parks and Recreation.
Neighborhood associations are integral for the work to maintain and improve neighborhood and area parks, to decide on park naming and special park memorials. Neighborhood associations are the citizen partners in Tucson, being beautiful. We also contribute material and monetary donations for parks improvement.
Transportation.
Neighborhood associations are the community assets that help maintain street landscaping, who report potholes, traffic and street flooding issues, and who participate through running public outreach to major street projects.
And Planning and Development Services.
Planning and Development Services is the department now responsible for registering neighborhood associations. They use neighborhood association contacts for almost all required notifications about projects, land use changes, and special exceptions.
And if you may, how many in this audience today regularly interact with any of these departments? Please stand. Okay, thank you. You can sit down. As you just heard, neighborhood associations are embedded in our city's communication with its citizens. This is why we believe that the city must invest in keeping neighborhoods strong. We applaud the city manager's proposed designation of Rebecca Roop as the Neighborhood Engagement Specialist for the city of Tucson. We see that as a start of what must be a major reinvestment of personnel and resources to ensure that this vital component of our city's well-being functions effectively now and into the future. Which brings us to a discussion about long-range planning for how the city will grow in the future. The bulk of Tucson's 55 neighborhood and area plans were written at a time when the city had a planning department and employed individuals who were charged with helping to write these plans to direct future growth and to preserve neighborhood character. They were written at a time when the city had a citizen participation office whose primary function was to assist citizens in their efforts to organize, to get plans for their areas, and to have a meaningful voice in the decisions that impacted them. The presence of these two offices did really remarkable things for the city of Tucson. They fostered an atmosphere of cooperation and fair-minded decision-making that included all stakeholders early in the process when developing new policies. A key question: where does that exist in today's city government? TRRG has shared with you the documentation of our concerns in this document that we sent to you. Today, I want to address those topics as goals. Goal 1, planning as a priority. Appendix D, the PDSD organizational chart that we downloaded from the city's website, shows that there is not a single employee out of the 50 listed on this chart whose title says that they deal with planning for future growth or whose job it is to assist neighborhood associations, even though this is where the last remaining vestiges of the Citizen Participation Office, Department of Neighborhood Resources were finally given a home. Appendix E lists the services that are now being rendered, and they are very minimal. Goal 2, adherence to the Unified Development Code. The code gives serious attention to neighborhood and area plans and to citizen participation with 257 references, as we show in Appendix C1 and C2. But time and again, we see citizen and neighborhood interests diluted or ignored because there is more important to rush through a development plan than it is to adhere to the spirit and the intent of these planning documents. One glaring example of this deterioration of citizen input is the relatively new concept that terms in the UDC like conform and comply have morphed into a meaning that says a need to be in basic harmony. That may be legally defensible, but it is really a slap in the face to the neighbors who understood the intent of those terms when they were put into the UDC. Goal number 3, a true public process. The future growth scenario map in Plan Tucson, Appendix B in your background materials, is another example of the public being duped into thinking that their planning documents mean anything anymore. That map was introduced at the 11th hour in the Plan Tucson process. It was put together with very little input from the neighborhoods who are most impacted by the colored blobs that you see on the map. A disclaimer was put on the map stating it does not indicate city policy, but if you look at any rezoning that is sent to you for approval, it is justified as being in agreement with this growth scenario map. Goal 4, policy and a procedure to update neighborhood plans. Appendix A, taken from Plan Tucson, ends with a statement stating the need for updating the specific plans. Sadly, at the present time, there is a lack of any mechanism, any process, or any personnel to update neighborhood and area plans or to assist neighborhoods who want to write such a plan. The plan amendment process was written for developers who want to exempt a single parcel from a condition in a plan. It was not intended to be used for updating plans, and it is totally inadequate for the updates that neighborhoods are considering for their plans. As the TRRG initiative demonstrated, we really have a host of citizens who are willing to do the work that is needed to invigorate their plans or to write new ones. But we really do need your help and leadership to accomplish this. I really cannot believe that you would want to waste the opportunity to breathe new life into planning documents that matter to our residents and that the city spent a lot of time and money to write originally. The importance of community support in strong neighborhoods and in long-range planning is not only evident in the attendance this afternoon, where people took time out of the middle of their day to come and support us, but also in the fact that we had 738 signatures on an online petition asking for your cooperation and help in starting this dialogue. I've given a copy of these signatures as well as the comments that were received from the petition that made up the comments that were part of the first page of your document. TRRG looks forward to working with the city, and thank you, Mr. Kazajic, for your offer to meet, and other interested parties to make our goals a reality. I would again like to ask who in this room is willing to work with the city in achieving these goals. Please stand. I think you see that you have a whole army of citizens who are willing to work to strengthen neighborhood plans, to help us update them, and to really go back to collaborative long-range planning. And I thank you very much for allowing me to make this presentation to you today.
Thank you, Bonnie. Steve, you had a series of questions. How do you want to handle that? You want Mike just to take it?
You were taking notes, that's one thing. And we also need to hear from the city manager in terms of the offer for engagement. I am going to reach out to Amber Smith and Michael Guyman and facilitate that first meeting, but that's a separate track. I was just troubled by frankly, by the tenor of their letter. It really did set up a dichotomy. It's us versus them, and that's not the way we can move this community forward. And, but Rankin's was taking notes when I was talking about comply with and general conformity and advisory in nature only. 250 feet equals 500 feet, and where those really speak to the role that neighborhood plans play in the whole consideration of rezoning discussions, and whether or not we need to amend a plan or not, whether or not a particular rezoning proposal is in conformity and complies with, which is the language of the UDC. And so that's a first step, and then we should hear about the resources that we're willing to invest and where the engagement you feel is most appropriate now that we've got Rebecca on the saddle.
Okay, Mr. Rankin, and then Mr. Ortega.
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Kozaczyk, rest of the council. I'll just start with answering your fundamental question, which is, are plans important? And yes, plans are important. That includes both the general plan and the different types of specific plans, which means area plans, neighborhood plans, and we have a couple of sub-regional plans as well. But it's important to understand in what context they're important. They are plans, they are not laws, okay? And Councilmember Kozaczyk was describing it accurately when he said that the plans come into play when the mayor and council are making decisions on rezoning applications, or if there's a special exception request, and there are a couple other types of procedures where plan compliance is required, which includes flexible lot developments, FLDs. And so it all drills down to that question that you've asked a couple of times. What does that mean? That a rezoning proposal has to conform to or comply with or be consistent with the general plan and or the applicable area plan. And yes, you've heard about the Phoenix case, because that's the case that addresses that issue. And in that case, it did involve a rezoning request that included a building with a height twice what the plan included as a limit, so 500 feet instead of 250 feet. And what the court did is they said, well, you got to look at the plan in its entirety, not just one particular element of it, height. And you have to look at whether the proposal conforms overall and complies with, and the language the court used was, in basic harmony with the requirements of the plan. In that instance, they found that a zoning ordinance that allowed a height of 500 feet, even though the plan limited height to 250 feet, was still in conformance with the applicable plan because the uses were consistent with the plan, the open space set-asides were consistent with the plan, the setbacks were consistent with the plan, the landscaping was consistent with the plan. And so given all those things, the court said, the proposal is in basic harmony with the underlying plan. And the issue that I don't want you to just think from that then that provisions within the plans can just be lightly disregarded, and quite frankly, the city hasn't done that. And if you look at the instances of the plan amendments that we've had over the last year or two, we've had applications where we have required the applicant to go through a plan amendment for a height amendment, right? That was far less than twice what the underlying plan put the limit at. So staff does apply the neighborhood plan, the area plan, and the general plan as part of the review for a rezoning or special exception application. And staff reviews it in terms of what does the plan say, what is the proposal proposing, and is the proposal consistent with or conform to the underlying plan. But the cases do make it clear that plans are not laws, okay? They are policies, they are guidance, they are direction to inform discretionary zoning decisions, okay? So they are important, but they're important in that context. They are not like an overlay zone. They do not add additional zoning requirements or different zoning entitlements to the property, okay? And they don't change zoning. So if a property has a commercial zoning, but the neighborhood plan says, we really think it should be residential or some other type of development in this area, they can proceed with that commercial development under their existing zoning, and the neighborhood plan doesn't and can't change that. Okay, so it's a plan. It applies going forward. It applies when there are discretionary decisions relating to a change in zoning or a redevelopment that requires a change in zoning. And then it's evaluated in that context. Plans can be amended, and plan amendments, as you know, we've had a handful of them in the last year. Typically, they come forward because there's an application for a redevelopment that includes a rezoning request or a special exception request. That's what's going to trigger the request for a plan amendment. The mayor and council also have the authority to initiate a plan amendment for any of the neighborhood plans or area plans that have previously been adopted by the mayor and council. Bonnie is correct that most of the area and neighborhood plans were put together and approved back in the 1980s. Okay, so some of them are pretty dated. And we've adopted a couple of general plans since then. But there haven't been a lot of changes to the underlying area and neighborhood plans except in the context of individual rezoning requests.
Mike Ortega, I think there was also a request from Steve, and probably of interest to everyone here, as to what resources you're looking to go forward with to work with the neighborhoods.
Sure, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, as we discussed during the budget process, we did allocate additional resources to the Planning and Development Services Department. As I outlined for you in my memorandum, one of those positions is specifically a neighborhood liaison. Now, keep in mind that that's not the only effort that we're putting forth. As we've discussed a few times now, the update of Plan Tucson will be key. And so the conversation is on a macro level. And I think that the discussion around the process for updating Plan Tucson, as well as all of the pieces around that, is where I think this conversation can be key. Now, clearly, there are different paths we can take. Ultimately, the Plan Tucson conversation is one of how do neighborhood plans fit into that, and does it make sense if the expectation is one thing for the force of or the legality of in terms of implementation of a plan, do we spend the time to update it? How does that all work? And I think those are all conversations that can happen as a part of the Plan Tucson conversation. So that's one. Item two, I think that as we go forward, really, and the presentation by Trig outlines how engaged neighborhood associations and neighborhoods are with all of the services that we provide. I think that it's probably unfair to just focus on the planning piece by itself. I think there are, it's a broader conversation about, how we're addressing some of our parks issues and some of the things that we've talked at this table with regard to the engagement of those neighbors. And I can tell you that we are absolutely committed to that relationship. And as far back as I believe almost 18 months ago, when Trig came and asked about the neighborhood plans and offered to help, I said, absolutely, we need all the help we can get. I think that with Rebecca's help, we can start to craft what that looks like going forward. I don't have the expectation it will be done immediately, but with the understanding of what that ultimate configuration and relationship looks like, I think there can be some value there. Lastly, I'll just close in suggesting to you that this will be fluid. I think that as time goes on and we start having a better understanding of what that planning effort looks like, then there may be a need for us to rethink how we allocate resources. That's all, Mr. Mayor.
So how do we respond to the comments about use of that map in justifying rezoning requests when the disclaimer is clearly stated on the map that it's not going to be used for that purpose?
So, Mr. Mayor, members of council, Councilmember Kozaczek, the disclaimer in the general plan with respect to that map says that it's a concept map for illustrative purposes only, identifying a range of potential areas of opportunity throughout the city. It does not constitute zoning regulation, establish zoning district boundaries, or indicate official city policy relating to specific sites. The categories and colors must be interpreted based on the policies contained in Plan Tucson, generally, the overall general plan. So, as indicated in the staff report, the map isn't used to supplant any other plans or override other approved plans, but it is part of the information that was included in Plan Tucson, and so it is referred to in terms of guidance for zoning or development decisions.
Okay. Councilman Romero.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for the presentation, Bonnie, and for Trig for your participation and thoughtfulness in putting this presentation together and all of the work that you've done. I think there's two fundamental questions, for me at least. First and foremost, what are the services that we're going to make sure that we create as mayor and council to make sure that the voices of neighborhoods are part of our, not just to keep, as you talked about, just to be in our eyes and ears and feet and hands and everything on the ground, but on the future planning of how we want to look within the next 20 years and more. I think we have I think right now is a really good time to have this discussion because our general plan is about to expire. And so it will take a couple of years for all of us to do the work on updating that plan or starting from scratch. We have some options there. And so the first fundamental question that I think I have for our city manager is, how do we continue investing in neighborhood services? When I used to be a program coordinator for Pima County with neighborhood reinvestment, I remember a neighborhood services department. And the work that department offered neighborhoods in terms of the resources provided was absolutely invaluable. And a little at a time, because, and I must admit, because of the Great Recession that we went through, it was dismantled. And to be honest with you, I think, Bonnie, you and Ruth Beaker were sitting 3 years ago at a budget retreat discussion where one of my questions to the city manager was like, when are you going to return those neighborhood services to us? Because it not only affects the neighborhoods that don't have the resources, but also the council offices and the mayor's office that had severely cut our budgets and had very little money to be able to have council aides and neighborhood liaisons to the neighborhoods. And so the council offices have also felt that lack of resources because we became a catch-all. And that's good. I'm glad as a council office that we hear all that, and that as much as we possibly can with the 3-person staff that we have in our offices, at least mine, we can do as much as we possibly that is humanly possible we can do. So neighborhood resources for me is good. I feel it's a really good step forward in assigning Rebecca Roop, that is very experienced, that has a lot of work under her belt in terms of working and engaging neighborhoods in planning processes. But we need more. We really do need more. We need more in terms of constituent services in the council offices, and we need more in terms of neighborhood services, either through planning and development services or some organized approach to it. And then 2, my question is, how do we work with the neighborhoods to create these neighborhood plans, right? Because there are some neighborhoods in Ward 1 that have no neighborhood plan, or if they do have a plan, it was put together back in the 80s. It's a 3-page plan that doesn't really explain much. So I guess before all this process continues, how will we as a city approach the neighborhood planning that needs to happen? Or is it area plans that we focus on as a city? I know for a fact that the general plan touched a little bit about I think we called them service area or service areas. And so do we focus our efforts in planning service areas and then have the neighborhoods work to make sure that we're either finding staff to fund this really intricate, lots of work that needs to go into neighborhood plans and area plans. So I guess that's my question. How do we approach this process, and how do we move forward so that that we can help make it happen? I know one of the neighborhoods in Ward 1, Barrio Kroger Lane, is going to a architecture landscape planning firm, and that firm is doing work pro bono. But how do we organize ourselves through this? So I guess that's my question to the city manager and the Planning Development Services Department. How do we approach this, and how do we move forward knowing that there is lack of resources as we have it right now?
Mr. Ortega?
So I'd like to actually, before you answer, add on to that, because if you've got neighborhoods going to secure architectural AEs to help update their plans, why? At the end of the day, the answer is going to be we're going to fall back on the Phoenix case, where general conformity means whatever it seems to mean. I don't think anybody with a straight face, even the Chamber of Commerce, were saying, if it were being built in their backyard, would say 250 feet is the equivalent of 500 feet. It complies with. So I have a tough time recommending to any of the neighborhood associations that they go out and begin this lift of updating their plans or getting an architectural firm on board if at the end of the day comply with doesn't mean comply with, but it actually means generally conform to. That's the lack of clarity that I have.
So, Mr. Mayor, Councilman Romero, there's actually two parts to your question. The first was, do we need more? The answer is yes. Right? I think we all agree with that, and we've had many, many conversations about finite resources and the allocation of those resources and so forth. So the key for me is, how do we address that? I know that in this budget year, I worked with you all to increase dollars for constituent services in the ward offices, and we're hoping that that'll help on some of the, we'll call them the requests for service that you get on a regular basis. But clearly, when you look and you take a step back and you saw the various departments, all of those departments put some effort into addressing constituent issues and constituent complaints. But I think that falls short, quite frankly. And again, I'm speaking openly with you. I think the reality is the coordination of a response is one thing, but the true conversation around what do the neighborhoods want for their parks specifically, what do they want for their, picket right, all of the services that were outlined. I think that's a bigger conversation. Now, one of the things that I'm hopeful in the coming year is, how do we take the neighborhood coordinator, the neighborhood liaison, and truly start having those discussions internally to start allocating those resources and moving folks away from just a reactive to a complaint or an issue that comes up, and instead looking at it more holistically as to how we can engage folks on, okay, how do we deal with those issues now that they've been brought to us? So that's the first piece. The second piece that you mentioned is, how do we deal with the neighborhood plans? And it goes back to Councilor Casase's question. The bottom line is, we're in the midst of our Plan Tucson update. In my opinion, and I'm going to keep coming back to that because I do think that there are mechanisms whereby the engagement of the public will be key to that. Not only because ultimately public needs to vote on it, but in the, we'll call it the right way to do things is to engage and have conversation around that. And I believe that there's a link, a strong link between Plan Tucson efforts, if you will, and those neighborhood plans. With regard to your specific question, I wouldn't disagree with you in terms of if we're going to update or we're going to encourage the update, there has to be clarity on what the value of that is or on what that ultimate use of that plan will be. And I think that's part of what has been frustrating for folks is I don't think that clarity was there. I think that we have been consistent, but I also think that there's opportunity for us to be clearer when we have conversations with neighbors as they're going out and having these discussions. And ultimately, we can outline it for them, walk them through it. But I don't necessarily disagree that if they're going to update something with the expectation that it'll carry the force of law when it doesn't, then I couldn't in good conscience recommend that either.
But it's the UDC that says that that needs to be comply with, not neighborhood plans. That language comes out of law, not out of the policy that we're talking about. And if that word doesn't mean what it means, then why don't we just take it out of the UDC 257 times?
The language in the UDC tracks the statutory language, and what I was trying to get across with my example of how we've actually applied that language, look at the case in question. It's probably the one that got everyone together here, right, on the fries. And there it was an adjustment, I think, from 20 feet to 26 feet. And we said, as a city, you have to go through a plan amendment, okay? So that shows that we give much more credence and weight to the underlying plan than just, saying, well, that's less than twice as much, so you don't need a plan amendment.
But I don't want to relitigate.
So there is meaning.
Yeah, I get it. I don't want to relitigate the fries thing, but what we wound up doing in that was amending their neighborhood plan at the end of the day through the rezoning process when we changed the drainage questions, the open space questions, the neighborhood commercial questions, and we relied on a neighborhood plan amendment change of 6 or 8 feet, but back at the end of the process changed all the rest of that stuff. And by the way, it's still a vacant lot. So if neighborhood plans are to further refine the general plan, and yet at the end of the day that further refinement doesn't have any force of law or policy, then why are we doing it? And that's the general question that I've got, and I'm not sure. Do you want to? You're standing at the mic. I asked you to. Go ahead.
Just a very few comments. When it comes to money, I think everyone in this room understands the budget, the recession, the fact that we don't have the back to basics money that we used to have to invest in neighborhoods. We don't have the federal support for planning. But I think that instead of just saying we don't have the money and going home, what we need to do is sit down with our elected leaders and with staff and even with the business community to find out how do we find the funding to be able to do that, and not just leave it on the city manager to try and come up with some magic formula that will create a fund of money that's not there. So I think we need to have that conversation. I also think that one of the big issues is neighborhood character. We can talk about planning service areas, and I think we all understand infill development is the way that we can make the best use of our infrastructure. But planning service areas don't ever deal with neighborhood character. That's what the neighborhood plans do. And those plans, when they were written when planning department had a staff of 4 planners who worked on 2 or 3 plans that took a year or more to put together. But do you know how many of us sat at those tables, that sat with our neighbors, that sat with the business people who were there, or the out-of-town property owners who were concerned that we were going to make a change to what they could do to their land? It actually stimulated this community conversation that fostered a lot of cross-pollination. And that's what we need. The other thing we need is early involvement in policies that affect us. When you make changes to the UDC, I'll give you an example. This whole idea of a concurrent process of having a rezoning and a plan amendment, TRRG contacted PDSD numerous times saying, when can we sit down with stakeholders and talk about this issue? And they said, oh, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. And then we turn around and find out that they provide a report to you that didn't include any discussion with the public before they came to that report. So now our job is to respond to that report. We don't want to do that. We want to be involved early with all of the stakeholders to be able to say, these are the things that matter, and to be able to broaden the breadth of ideas that can come from having that kind of early participation. The city of Santa Fe, someone pointed out to me the other day, for any rezoning that goes through in the city of Santa Fe, they have an early neighborhood notification process that they have to follow. I have a form right here about what goes into that process. It involves somebody from the city, it involves the developer, and it involves the neighborhoods before any plan is submitted to the city at all. We want to be involved early in those discussions. And I think when it comes to the idea of updates, we value our plans, but we realize that it's the mayor and council who ultimately put the importance in their decision-making on whether or not those plans mean anything to them. Most of you, with the exception of Councilmember Scott, were not members of the mayor and council when they were agreed upon and when they were voted on. And so you don't have the same investment that those people had at the beginning of this process. And yet, those of us who still live in our neighborhoods after 30 and 40 years, we still have that commitment. And that's what we're asking for you, is to update them, to respect them, to allow us a process where we can reach out to the public and do a process that involves everyone within our boundaries to come up with the updates that we think are necessary for you to now approve a new edition of our plan and have the same commitment to it that the original council members had when they agreed to those plans.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, anybody else? Councilmember Scott?
I do hear what you're saying. Yes, I've been there and done that for many years and have great respect for the role that neighbors do have in the development of things within their boundaries. We in Ward 4 have had an enormous number of those kinds of events, and there's been great participation as things move along. I think it's very important to note that when something comes forward, at whatever stage, that ongoing conversation with the parties involved needs to continue. And in some cases, the one party may have walked away from the discussion and there was no further communication because they were frustrated. I think that's sad, and that has to be avoided if possible, because ongoing conversation and continuing the discussion works in a better way than not. So I just point that out as one thing. I do know that the Planning and Department Services has worked really hard to reorganize itself and become more streamlined, and I salute our director, Scott Clark, for having a, quote, service first motto in that department. And believe me, I've been here long enough to see the changes that are very significant for all parties. So I have to point out that they've been doing their part to try to reorganize and make things better. This council has given recent direction for Planning and Development Services to complete a long list of planning priorities for the city of Tucson, and it includes the following: create 5 economic investment corridors, create a transit-oriented development plan, create an inclusive housing study, and a long list of other planning projects I'm sure Scott Clark can list for us. Those each individually are very huge projects. My question for Scott is, how does the department plan to achieve the current list of planning projects we have directed your department to do? How can you do all of that? We have another big issue in front of us, but you've got many on your plate. Are you ready to answer that question, Mr. Clark? And what are our current advanced planning staffing levels, and how does that compare to cities our size? So that's a two-part.
Honorable Mayor and Council, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. So what the city manager and mayor have asked me to do is put together a work plan that encompasses all the projects you just mentioned. We have a draft of that we're working on. And the way you accomplish the workload you've given to us with the staff what we had is basically time and space. You lay that calendar out and say these resources can attack this particular planning effort and what are the top priorities. So the priorities you've given us were the economic investment corridors, you've talked about the transit-oriented development, and then start moving into Plan Tucson. Additionally, we're doing the historic listing on the west side right now, and we're looking at west side planning efforts also. So it is a sizable workload. I think we can manage that, but it takes time and space, and you'll see that work program coming up. The manager will be taking a look at it and providing some guidance back to me. So it's not something you can do all at once. Planning takes time, has been mentioned here a couple times. It's usually a couple planners for a year to a year and a half working on an individual plan to get there. Plan Tucson will be a 36-month effort. That conversation will begin in 2020, and we've started to have that conversation last month when we brought you the Plan Tucson update. As far as resources go, some cities have massive planning departments. Austin has like 400 people just in their tree planting group.
Wow.
That's not going to happen here. We currently have 4 long-range planners. We brought on Corin Manning to start to spearhead that effort. She's put together a work plan, and we're moving forward on that. But it really does come back to mayor and council priorities and what direction you want us working on.
So you have 4 planners in your department at this time,
There's 4 people we can identify as long-range planners. Yeah,
and they already head up several of these very large projects.
they do.
I just wanted to bring that forward, and so that sort of gives a perspective, an overall perspective of what the manager will have to look at carefully to see how to move forward with the suggestions we've heard today. And I agree that some of the neighborhood plans, including the My Neighborhood Plan, goes back before I had gray hair.
So, Scott, before you leave, the resource that you didn't mention, we're not talking about just your 4 people. The resource you didn't mention is sitting behind you. And we had a Sunshine Mile overlay public open house on Saturday that was full. And you had Corin there, and you had Rebecca there, and I don't know what other your staff there, but lots of these people were there too, saying we want to be a part of this process. So nobody is asking the city to do this lift in terms of planning and development and working through these processes, flying solo or with 1 or 2 or 3 of your people. It is, and I think what you're hearing from Bonnie and from some of the others, if they were speaking here, is get them involved in the process and let them help you with the lift. So, Shirley, they're not trying to do it on their own. They're not trying to do it with 4 people, but with 400 people.
Honorable Mayor and Council, I agree. And I do want to come back to...
Well, then we're going to reach out and do that cross-pollinating. And instead of just being Trigg and the Chamber of Commerce, I'll make sure that your office is involved as well, and Ortega's as well, and Hispanic Chamber. We'll get people in the same room, and we'll pull these documents aside and throw them on the table and say, where can we find common ground? So it's not an us versus them deal, but how do we bring the resources in this room to bear on the questions that have been raised, and so we don't have this dichotomy going on in the city anymore that we're fighting each other all the time. That's where we need to get.
Sounds like a good idea. Thank you all for coming today. We appreciate it. Bonnie, thank you for the presentation. It's much appreciated. Thank you. All right.
And we also ought to thank whoever their choreographer was too.
Yeah, that was good. All right. Items 1 and 2 are executive session. Ms. Clerk?
The executive session is noticed as item 1, executive session, potential sale of Tucson Metro Chamber Building, 465 West St. Mary's Road, and is being held pursuant to ARS Section 38-431.03, A3, A4, and A7.
We have a motion to go executive session. Motion and second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Let's go. session. What's the council's pleasure for item number 2?
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to move that the mayor and council direct the city manager to proceed as discussed in executive session.
Got a motion and a second. Any other discussion on that matter? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? All right, that will stand. Let's move into item 4, TARP facility upgrades scheduled for 20 minutes. Staff has an update on the proposed upgrades to the Tucson Airport remediation project facilities. I see Mr. Tamir coming up. Mr. Manager?
Mr. Mayor, this is just an update. There's a lot of questions that sometimes get asked. Wanted to make sure you're up to date, as well as outlining some of our future plans. To ask Tim to come and have a conversation with you. With that, I'll turn it over to Director Tim Tamir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. The purpose of today's study session is to, as the manager indicated, update you on where we're at with some of the activities out at the TARP facility. First and foremost, council previously gave us direction to implement with what we called Alternative 3+, which was efforts to clean up the plume faster in whatever feasible manner we could do that. And that included the drilling and equipping of a 10th well that would be connected to the system, and an expansion of the treatment plant in order to handle the higher flow volume and the higher volume of contaminants that are coming in to be able to be removed.
Tim, if I may, Mr. Mayor. Tim, when you talk about the option 3+, this is based on, I think, year-long or more conversations had with community regarding TCE and the TCE plume. And one of the issues that mayor and council pushed was eliminating the TCE plume faster, right? So can you talk a little bit about what that consists of? Because I know that this was basically out of the conversations we had with the community and affected communities in the south side of Tucson. Can you expand a little bit more just to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to option 3+?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. This is absolutely an outcome of input from the citizens of Tucson, in that there was already a remedy up and running for remediation of the treatment of the plume itself. And the input from the community was, that's great, but is there a way we can do it faster and try to really accelerate how quickly that groundwater cleanup would occur? So what was proposed is there are currently 9 wells that are operated to pump contaminated groundwater from the plume and deliver it to the treatment plant for treatment and delivery. Those 9 wells were all configured based on how the plume was back in the 1980s, 1990s. Where we are today is there's been a significant amount of TCE removal, and there's relatively little TCE left in the groundwater, but it is in a different location. It's now toward kind of the northern end of the plume. And so the addition of this 10th well is right in the heart of where the remaining mass of TCE remains, and it'll help us remove that from the groundwater much more quickly than it would be with the current configuration, and allow us to reduce those levels even faster.
Can you talk about the difference between staying the amount of years, the difference between staying with what the path was forward versus through community involvement, what this 10th well will do in terms of the amount of time that it will take to remove TCE from the water plume?
Yeah. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, the addition of the 10th well will reduce the time frame for cleanup by about 10 years. So it's a full decade that would come off the time frame. So,
Tim, in reading the materials, it looks like if I'm reading the materials right, you're asking for council to direct you today to authorize the going forward with the 10th well. Is that correct?
Mr. Mayor, we already have the authorization to do the 10th well.
Okay.
What we're asking for today is authorization to also do full-scale treatment at that facility for perfluorinated compounds.
Yeah, and you've got a chart in here that shows different values, and I thought there was a recommendation to follow what would be that middle path, I guess I would call it. Are you looking for that?
That's correct.
Okay. So Why don't you explain then what those alternatives are real quickly so we can, and give us your recommendation.
Sure. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, if you look at page 1 of 2 of the supplemental materials for the mayor and council communication, it shows you a table that lays out 3 different treatment alternatives at the TARP facility to manage perfluorinated compounds. And these are those most recent compounds we've discovered that are present in the groundwater in a couple locations in Tucson, including at TARP. In this case, we benefit from the fact that we already have partial treatment there. It was installed as part of the advanced oxidation process in order to manage 1,4-dioxane, a different compound. And the treatment process we're referring to as granular activated carbon. And that removes perfluorinated compounds from the water flow. It was not designed to do that. It was designed for 1,4-dioxane treatment to do the quenching of peroxide coming off another process. But because it was there, it actually has been helping us manage the PFAS or perfluorinated compounds. What is shown here on this table are 3 different ways that we could potentially provide for properly designed, properly sized, full-scale, long-term treatment and removal of the PFAS. The one we're recommending is the middle one called GAC lead lag. It has an initial capital cost of approximately $9.9 million. And the reason we're here today is that's not in our current capital program. The 10th well, all of that other stuff is in the capital program, but this would be on top of it. So we're seeking your authorization to do that. One of the benefits, even though it's a bit more expensive than a different approach to GAC, which is referred to as lead only, its benefits include the following. One is it actually is called a lead lag configuration, meaning that we have redundancy on the treatment. In a lead-only configuration, if we don't have exact calculations on how long the GAC would last before the chemicals would start to come through, you could run the risk of those chemicals coming through into the treated water stream. We don't want to have that, so we'd recommend the lead lag configuration where you always have redundancy and you have the ability to continuously treat and have effective removal. The other way that could be done is a different process known as ion exchange. That's the alternative all the way on the right side of that chart, but you can see it has a significantly higher capital outcome or outlay in the beginning. It also has almost a double annual operating and maintenance cost than doing a GAC lead lag configuration. So our recommendation is to go ahead and move forward with expanding the GAC from 8 vessels that we have now to 20 vessels, configure that in a lead lag configuration, and provide all the other upgrades necessary to handle that flow rate. And we also have a recommendation of how the water department would pay for that outlay. But that's the crux of it, is it gives us reliable treatment, long-term treatment, and it's when you look at the life cycle cost of capital outlay plus the annual operating and maintenance, it's actually amongst the cheaper options as well.
And what's the recommendation for how you're going to pay for it?
We have the ultimate backup plan for paying for it is we have 2 years ago, this council set up an infrastructure reserve within the water fund, and that has currently approximately $20 million in it. So we do have a reserve fund we could draw from if we need be, but we would draw on that third. The first thing we would do is this project would occur over fiscal years 20 and 21, takes about 18 to 24 months to complete. During those 2 fiscal years, any revenues that came to the water department in excess of our plan, we would first and foremost divert those toward this project. In addition, any expenses we have that come in under budget per our financial plan, we would use those savings to pay for it. And then only if the revenues and then savings expenses were not enough to cover the full impact, we would use the infrastructure reserve. But it's important to note that even if we got no excess revenues or had cost savings on our budget, we still have the money in the reserve to do this.
Okay, Councilman Kozaczek.
So the reality, though, is that ultimately, if we're successful in our litigation, this is going to be a cost captured in that litigation.
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Kozaczek, that is correct. We have a pending lawsuit that would, upon success, be reimbursement for these costs. We also have another mechanism through EPA and through the fact that this is a Superfund site that we could seek reimbursement for that through that mechanism. And we've already successfully done that for the treatment plant we have in place today through the advanced oxidation process. This council directed the department to go ahead and build that even before we got money coming in, and we were successful in getting reimbursement for that. We're also right now in the process of seeking reimbursement for the operating costs of the first 5 years of that. So we're tracking every cost related to perfluorinated compounds, and we would be seeking reimbursement and or using the proceeds from the lawsuit.
Right, and so given that, realizing the cost differences, how do the two processes compare in terms of their ability to capture this stuff?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, both ion exchange and granular activated carbon are recognized as effective treatment processes for perfluorinated compounds.
Is one significantly better than the other?
The answer to that is it depends on your water matrix, the actual water you're treating. So in our case, we've already done the bench scale testing, and actually we're doing testing in the field right now on our exact water with our exact composition of perfluorinated compounds, and the GAC is the effective treatment for that.
All right, so there's no sense in spending another $6 million for something that's equal or less in terms of ability to treat?
That's correct.
All right.
Councilmember Fimbres.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I was almost done.
I'm sorry, Scott.
So why aren't we pursuing the EPA option right now in terms of funding, or are we?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we actually are. We've already been in discussion with EPA about there's many layers to how we operate this facility, and there's a record of decision and a consent decree. So over time, we've been pursuing both remedy and reimbursement, but also having the record of decision reflect the most up-to-date treatment processes and effective strategies. So we're in the middle of actually going through the next process of that record of decision right now. And so that will take years to play out still, but we are including in our discussion of that how's the best way through EPA to approach reimbursement as well.
And is the 4 parts per trillion target for both the combined PFOS, PFOA, or is it 8 that you're targeting?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, it's a total of 4, and that's really driven by the method detection limit, which is the lowest level at which we can accurately measure these compounds, is 2 parts per trillion for PFOA and 2 parts per trillion for PFOS. So in current non-regulatory health advisory, right now we're looking at a combined total for the two.
Of 4.
So, and the EPA health advisory is 70 parts per trillion. Our internal operating target is 18, but our design would be 4, which is essentially below detection.
Yeah. So final question for Mr. Rankin. Do you know when is Science Day been scheduled yet?
So, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, Councilmember Kozaczek, Science Day has not been scheduled yet, and so Science Day refers to the hearing that the court is going to set up, probably most likely now in the fall of this year in the litigation. That's where the court, in a non-advocacy proceeding, hears from certain experts just to try to get educated on the science that's involved in the claims that are brought forward.
Councilmember Fimbres.
Mr. Mayor, I was going to move that Tucson Water be directed to spend up to $9.9 million as presented in today's study session memorandum in order to fund the installation of a 10th remediation well, additionally granulated activated carbon media, and the related infrastructure necessary to reach an operational target of less than 4 parts per trillion of PFOA plus PFOS coming out of the TARP treatment plant.
Second.
Got a motion and a second. I'm going to go to Councilman Romero and then come back.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to recognize that some members of the Unified Community Advisory Board are here. The chair, Yolanda Herrera-Lafond, Bobby Jaramillo, and Margie Mortimer, all here. Loyal attendants, of course, to UCAB. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Your work for the community is really appreciated, and we know that you are part of this solution, right? Because it really took a long time to come to a preferred solution, and this 10th well is something that we really, and I have to commend the Tucson Water Department for their work in really giving as much information as possible, putting together, including our office. I know that Ward 5 put together some tours of ARP and other water facilities for the community to see exactly what the city of Tucson does to protect residents, to deliver clean water. Talking about that, what does the timetable look like? Because, you know, every single time we've had an issue to build some of these, you know, capital to protect residents from any type of water contamination, the mayor and council have been really quick to say, do it as quickly as you possibly can to make sure that we're delivering the safest, cleanest water to Tucson residents. What's the timetable for this?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Romero, the time frame to complete all of the work discussed in the memo is 18 to 24 months. One of the really comforting parts of that is, though, because we already have granular activated carbon at the site, and in December and January, we changed out that GAC voluntarily, even though we weren't required to do so. We are already delivering water that's below the 4 part per trillion, and have been for months. So this timeline, while it will take 18 to 24 months, in the meantime, we expect to be able to meet those operational targets with our current configuration, and then have this in place just in time to continue that into the future.
Councilor Kozaczek.
With respect to the motion, we also have 1.4 million for O&M. Do we want to limit the motion to just 9.9 million, or should it expand to any cost associated with this?
I'd like some guidance. Mr. Tamir, Mr. Ortega, guidance on that.
Mayor, members of the council, we need to operate and maintain it. We plan to do that. It's implicit. If you'd like to make it explicit, then it's all costs associated with this. We are tracking those costs for future use or need. If so, you're welcome to do that. I think we certainly take that, but that was our intent.
All right, just as long as we're capturing all these costs, because they're going to be a part of our settlement request and litigation.
Yes, sir.
Okay, we got a motion and a second. Any other discussion on this matter? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? All right, thank you, Tim. Good
I have
job.
one more question, Mr. Mayor.
Sure, go ahead, Mr. Fimmers.
Tim, the other day there was a news story about ADEQ and the levels of chemicals in the water on the north side. Can you explain that?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. The news story talked about some groundwater contamination sites in and around Tucson. It centered on 3, kind of on the north part of the community. These are known sites. They're associated with either dry cleaners or landfills. There's about a dozen of these sites around Tucson. They focused on 3 because Arizona Department of Environmental Quality came down and had a routine public meeting with folks in those neighborhoods. When they ran the news story, they used the Tucson Water logo as a backdrop when it was actually an ADEQ meeting and process. But we just want to assure you that we're well aware of those contamination sites. We have no production wells in the vicinity. We've been tracking those for decades. No production wells and no contamination from those sites are in our drinking water supply.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Tim. All right, let's move on then to item 5, which is the fiscal year 2019-2020 recommended budget. Time has been set aside for discussion of fiscal year 2019-2020 recommended budget. Keep in mind that we do have a public hearing tonight on the recommended budget, followed by tentative budget adoption. Mr. Manager.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, this is the final step before the tentative budget is adopted in front of you this evening, or at least presented for consideration. We have had many conversations up to this point. Both Joyce and I are here and available to answer any questions that you might have in what's been presented. I think most of your concerns have been addressed, and I believe that the structurally balanced budget presented tonight is a great step forward from where we've been.
Okay, anybody have any questions? Councilmember Romero.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about the decompression as presented to Mayor and Council and as presented to the labor unions. How has that been resolved? I know that there was a conversation with AFSCME, and they had some concerns regarding decompression. Has there been additional conversations, and has that matter been resolved?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Romero.
Mutually beneficial.
Yes,
way.
Human Resources has met with AFSCME.
Okay.
They have seen the list, the decompression information. They are meeting with police command staff next week. And that's correct, sir. So yes, there has been conversations.
So, yes, there has been conversations, but have we come to a conclusion that is mutually acceptable for the decompression process?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Romero, I think you'll have to ask them if they're good with it, but the reality is we think that we have addressed their issues and their concerns. I think that through the council's leadership on the 1320, that was a big step. Decompressing those, I believe, is 40 positions or those classifications have really gone a long ways towards addressing some of those issues. And so we believe we've addressed it. We've incorporated the comments and thoughts, but obviously that you'll have to ask them.
So you don't know?
The impression we got is that we're good,
Okay.
but I guess we'll.
That's what I wanted to hear. If there was some
I don't want to speak for them, I
conversation
guess.
back and
Absolutely.
forth. Okay, good.
Absolutely.
And to be honest with you, I think that it's only fair to treat them as we've treated, other departments like police and fire that we've dealt with decompression issues, and that we just do the same thing all around, just to make sure that we're being as fair as we possibly can with the blue collar workers as well. So it sounds like there was a good conclusion after the conversations you've had.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Romero, I believe so, and I think that the spirit and intent of it fell in line with the direction you provided, gave us opportunity to really be creative in how we addressed it. I believe that we have done that, and we will continue to work. It's not a one-time and we're done. I think we're going to continue to work on this for a variety of years. That's the reality of what we've done, but I think we've made great strides this year. That's my opinion.
Okay.
And then another question that I have, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The Housing Community Development budget for acute home repair program remains of serious concern. Last month, I think, or this month earlier, there was a plan that HCD put together, their annual plan meeting, and HCD heard directly from folks on the ground about the severity of funding home repair and the home repair program. I'm concerned that the funding for these programs remains well under budget, under what is necessary. And I don't know if we use CDBG funds for home repair. I think before we used to, and then CDBG funds were cut for home repair, and general funds started being used for home repair. Would we be able to hear from HCD about this issue later on, if there's no one here to respond to that, or would you have an answer to this concern?
So, Mr. Mayor, Councilman Romero, I'd be happy to give you the answer, and if you'd like us to follow up, we'd certainly be happy to do that. As you know, we've had some changes in housing and community development. One of the things that I've challenged them to do is to think about what and how the community development dollars are used, not only in terms of complying, obviously, with the statutes and so forth, but to target some of these areas. I would agree with you. It would be wonderful to see more money go to home repair and so forth. We think there's opportunity to at least explore that. But quite frankly, we're trying to get a few other things in line before the end of the fiscal year. Okay. And so my hope and expectation is that a part of the new fiscal year and future applications, we're going to have a game plan together, which the council will have an opportunity to weigh in on and give us the shot in the arm, if you will, with some of those programs.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Kozaczek.
Are we squared away on the $180,000 for Veterans Court?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Kozaczek, I believe we are. So I sent you a note earlier today, and I apologize, it was late. I didn't expect you to be able to read it before this meeting. So I've asked the courts to look at funding that out of restricted monies for the coming year. It would be a one-time funding opportunity. But keep in mind, this is not for Veterans Court. Veterans Court funding is secure, and it has been for some time. These are for wraparound services, social services that are designated as important by the court. And so what we've done is we've challenged the nonprofits that will be providing that, or nonprofit that's providing that, for similar metrics to what the grants that they were losing require. And so if you look at the memo that the court administrator sent out, outlines what our expectations are going forward. We expect to have that information by the end of this week. But the short answer is yes, I wanted to expand on that because I think it's important that the council understand this is not for Vets Court funding. This is for the wraparound social services that are associated with that, and we have other mechanisms to address that.
Okay. Steve, just say, Mr. Manager, I read the memo right before I came down here, and it sounded like the court administrator had secured the funds. When Steve said 180, I think the question was going back and forth between 140 and 160, but.
Mr. Mayor, the reality is this, I would not, so it's up to 180 is the way that I've kind of looked at it, because ultimately I don't have the expectation that we'll establish a pot that magically gets spent over the year. We're going to challenge the actual use of that as it's drawn down.
Okay.
So part of the conversation that we're having internally is how we project out what those approximate costs are, because we don't know how many folks are going to go through that system. But ultimately, I can tell you we'll make sure that there's up to $180,000 available for that.
Got it.
So,
okay.
The fund balance shows on July 1st $119 million balance. How does that compare with our cash carry forward? Just kind of explain what that means, because we don't have $119 million to spend.
All right. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, so the way the fund balance is divided, it's actually in different layers. If you'll recall, when we've done other presentations, we have a certain amount that is unspendable, and what is unspendable is normally inventory. That's considered non-spendable, or monies that are set aside for a long-term purpose. So, for example, we have a long-term investment. So even though it's an asset, it's not spendable. We also have then restricted monies, and restricted monies are those which are restricted outside of the organization. So that could be, like we talk about, trying to remember some of them here. So we have things like restricted, usually with TPD, so they have a lot of restricted funding. So those dollars are set aside for those purposes. Then we have the assigned category, which, as we talked during the budget process, that's what we use our cash carry forward. So we say we're going to take these dollars and assign them for a particular purpose, like the permitting system, those types of items. Then we have our unrestricted fund balance. So that makes up all of these. I do not have the actual details at this time, but I think we have showed them to you in the past.
The general answer is so people see that they don't think that we have a cash carry forward of $120 million.
That's correct.
Schedule D, there's $492,000 transfer from the general fund to development fee fund. Is that impact fee reimbursements?
That is.
Okay.
That's correct.
Schedule F, I think it is. Yeah, F. Under business services, there was going from $20 to $26 million. Is it part of that of $3 million to stand up the self-insurance fund, or what's that increase about?
That increase is for the liability, the public liability and or public liability end. But
so one of the line items, the self-insurance fund at $11 million, is that?
The self-insurance fund would be shown under human resources, which is on page 16 of the same schedule.
And that one says $72 million.
It does. That is the total.
Is that a goal, refunding that? Because I'm confused about where we are
That
with
is
this
the
whole
budget,
self-insurance
and I
fund.
believe in the recommended budget, we actually outlined what all of the costs are planned.
Okay, so educate me again, because we're only putting a small amount in towards a reserve, and we're not going self-insured yet this year. We're not taking on a $72 million obligation to self-insure ourselves.
It was approved for self-insurance for fiscal year 20.
And that's,
And that is what that $72 million is. So remember, there's different components to
Yeah,
that.
so where-
So the
right,
health
where's that coming
insurance, you have the funding sources include not only the employer, but the employee. We have rebates from pharmaceuticals. It also includes other benefits besides medical, like dental, life, and all of that. It also includes administrative costs to run the program.
so excuse me, all of those costs are going to add up to $72 million. I mean, all those components are going to add up to $72 million. All right.
Is that, yeah.
Councilman Kozaczek, the previous memo that outlined that information. So I can distribute that, but I just wanted him to see what that breakdown was.
Well, I mean, some of that replaced by insurance premium we're no longer paying. Some of it costs, that administrative costs we would otherwise have.
So the
think we do
72
need an
million is the
explanation.
total all-in cost is what we're expecting, and that's basically what's shown up in the budget. It's outlined there on that piece of paper.
But had we not done that this year?
We did not do it for fiscal year 19. It's the first time for fiscal year 20.
Had we not done it for 20, would that have been $72 more million we would have had elsewhere?
No, sir.
That's
it
what
would
I think
not.
the question is.
It's just really, it's taking the dollars from another area, which was an agency fund, and putting it into a separate trust fund.
But an agency fund being what was paying our health insurance.
That's correct.
Okay.
So it's not new dollars. I think that's your question.
Yeah.
Or new expenses.
We have a pretty big number showing up in the budget, $72 million, and where's that going to come
And
from?
that's so
Yeah.
how we do it now is we charge out the different places for the employer contributions. The employees, of course, come from their paycheck. It's put into what we call an agency fund that doesn't have expenses, and then we take those dollars and we pay for the medical insurance. So this format, this new fund, that whole accounting transactions is different.
And are any of those funding sources questionable or at risk, or are we just rolling the dice hoping we get to that number, or are they sure?
So our plan is to stay, that is our plan. We're expecting the revenues to be a little bit more, so that there will be about a $3 million, and I believe it's in the memo there.
It was three.
Reserve $3 billion at the end of the fiscal year. And, medical claims are medical claims, so we'll have to see. We have to put a lot within our wellness program.
And where does our, Mr. Ortega, or Joyce, where do we stand in terms of building up our reserve fund?
And I just want to clarify, are you talking the reserve fund for the self-insurance? Or, okay, for the self-insurance. So what we're planning to do is we're going to watch the claims very closely. So what will happen, there won't be any claims that come in July. We'll be finishing up with the old plan in June, and those claims usually don't come until like July, and then they trickle in August. So that's under the old plan. So we'll have cash in July. We'll have some cash in August. So then as the July claims come in, the cash flow will be such, and we'll keep our eye on the cash flow, that there should be plenty to pay those claims as they come in. And then we'll look at it during the fiscal year and see if we need to make any adjustments.
And the cash comes from premiums?
Correct. And Mr. Mayor, Councilman Kozaczek, so there's two things going on here. One is on that piece of paper outlines what we're expecting to have in true reserve, but then there's also the cash flow. And the cash flow is really something we hadn't thought about when we were talking about it a couple of years ago. And that's, as Joyce just outlined, we're expecting 45 days to even 60 days. We're not going to get much in the way of claims, but we're going to keep paying into the fund. And so 72 million, round number, is about 5 to 6 million a month. So in 45 days, we're up to 7.5, almost 8 million. And so that then becomes that cushion for cash flow. Now, keep in mind that if for whatever reason we ever decided to go away from this, we'd still have to continue to keep those dollars for that tail coverage. So just like we're taking advantage of not having to pay anything from July 1 to, say, the middle of August, on the other end, we would have to keep dollars to be able to pay that. That's just how the insurance
I
works.
understand the cash flow, but we had also had a conversation about putting some money into that reserve to build it up.
Correct.
How much is there? How much is sitting there? 6 or 7?
Right now, we have 400,000.
So we have 400,000, but what is projected for the dollars income?
The
So it's 3 million. So we'll
That's
have
the 3.
3 to 4. Right?
All right.
Yeah. And I think that's a solid number.
It's the 3 plus the cash flow.
I'm sorry?
It's the 3 plus the cash flow.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. So there you add
So
the
it's
3 to the
36
7, it's
or
about
so.
10 million, right?
Okay, Councilman Cunningham.
All right, I've got a few things. First of all, we had that $8 million bump on general fund this year, but we're budgeting for 567 next year. We came in at 551. We went from 543 to 551, and we're budgeting for 567 next year. You guys comfortable with that? I just want to make sure.
Mr. Mayor, Council Member Cunningham, we're comfortable with that.
Okay. I see that we aren't anticipating any increase at all in state shared income tax. Will that change at the end of this session? There's a couple. I mean, they haven't done the state budget yet, so do we really? I mean, that number's up in the air. Are all signs looking that we're going to stay flat, or we might see a little bit of a hedge in that 65 million number we're taking?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Cunningham, the income tax piece of the state shared revenue is pretty well set, because that's set, it's based on a 2-year lag. So the dollars that we're getting are from 2 years ago. It just distributed. The state budget generally will not affect the formulaic distribution of those dollars. Usually it's heard for other hits that we might take, but those are set.
I saw that this is the first year in about 3 that our fund balance takes a little bit of a dip. Not that we spent 3 years really building it. And I want to make sure that for next year we're building in capacity for some of the things we need to be doing. We still have some service delivery and some things we want to do within the city to keep this momentum going. And we probably want to start having those discussions around the end of the summer already. There's a few things that we still want to do as far as fire service, parks, roads, that isn't built in here, but we want to find a way to do it. And, ever since I got onto the city council, we've always been in cost containment budget mode. We've got a little to work with, but we can't keep our eye off the ball. We've got some chunk strategies. I call them chunk strategies that can yield us another $3 or $4 million in either cost avoidance or cash or revenue increases. And it's important to keep those chunks recommended going into the next fiscal year. I know that we're going through the plan and we're going as fast as we can, but there's a few that I wouldn't mind seeing implemented in the next year that could probably help us with getting a few of those chunks, and that can allow us to do some of the things that we're still on the hook for. Because though the city has improved tremendously from both a financial stability standpoint and just a quality of service standpoint and a number of things, where there's still areas that we're lagging, and we've really got to find those revenue sources. And that brings me to another piece, and I don't know how open I want to talk about it. Are we, how do I say this generally? Have we programmed in with these numbers on some of our enterprise funds and parks funds? Have we programmed these in on the assumption that certain fees, whether they be enterprise or will stay flat, or will they go up, or we have just assumed they'll be the same? Because we have some negotiations that are going on. Is kind of where I'm.
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Cunningham, there is no assumption of increases in fees in this budget. If those conversations occur during the year, we'll have them at that point. But at this point, this budget does not assume there are increases in fees. Each enterprise function will go through and calculate based on the current fee rate or rates and current fee structure what those revenues are for the coming year. So I believe water's dips a little bit, and the reason for that is based on consumption. But other areas are pretty flat. If you look at them, it's either a function of additional users or customers, or a reduction in the actual consumption, as in water.
Or if one of our biggest customers happens to experience a small increase. That you know the one I'm talking about. So that's kind of, that was where we're not assuming that at this point. That's all. Okay, I'm good.
Okay, anybody else? Councilmember Fimbres.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. From Schedule C, what does miscellaneous under mass transit fund specifically entail?
Sure, Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Fimbres, what the miscellaneous revenues are, those are usually sale of property, and I mean not just land, but any kind of asset that the agency, the funding would bring in. And then also we have some unclaimed monies that might go into miscellaneous. We have when employees go on jury duty and then they get paid by jury duty because we pay them for that, their wages, they reimburse the city for anything they get. So it's just miscellaneous
So that's all.
revenue sources that are in there.
Okay, and with the recent annexations, what does, on Schedule C, the residential refuse revenue is projected to have a small increase, if any?
It does have a small residential increase, and that's just for, it's only 1%, so it's very minor. And I think, as Mr. Ortega pointed out, we just take into consideration if there's more usage. Mm-hmm.
Okay, anybody
just to
else?
clarify, we're not assuming any new annexations.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, that's correct, sir.
Yeah, correct.
Anybody else? If not, we'll have our public hearing tonight and vote on the tentative budget. Okay, let's move on then to item 6, primary jobs incentives for Project Micro, scheduled for 15 minutes. Staff will present the results of the economic analysis for the Project Micro request. Ms. Coffey, Mr. Chakowski, who's coming? Mr. Manager.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, this is a report on Project Micro, I believe we call it now. So staff's available to answer any questions on that. Go ahead, Barbara.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of council. This item relates to seeking your authorization to move forward to drafting a development agreement if we should go forward with Project Micro. Basically, what it is, for your information, the project consists of a 34,000 square foot medical facility in Ward 4. It creates 37 jobs, and 22 of those meet the wage criteria set out in our primary jobs incentive program. So that total incentive package is there in your materials and prorated based on those actual number of jobs created.
Okay. Councilmember Fimbres, I'm sorry, Councilmember Scott, this is in your ward?
Yes, it is, and I'm very pleased that this is moving forward. As you know, in Ward 4, we have not had a micro hospital of any kind until this moment. And if we move forward with this, this will be the first one of maybe others. And I'm very pleased that in the 100 square miles we call Ward 4, we'll finally have hospital care for the people who live in that area. So with that, I'd like to move forward with this program.
And I'll second that motion.
All right, got a motion and a second. Any other discussion on this matter? Hearing none. All in favor say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? All right, simple enough. Thank you, Ms. Coffey. All right, let's then move on to item 7, Central Business District expansion, scheduled for 20 minutes. Staff has an update on the proposed boundary expansion of the Central Business District. Looks like we have the same players at the table. Mr. Manager.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, at the last meeting, you asked for a more legible map. I think some of the language for this, or the words or the letters for the streets were a little small, so we apologize for that. So we've distributed a new map which shows and outlines the roads, and I think it's easier to follow. Staff's available to answer any questions. We are recommending that you consider moving this forward. We'll bring it back to you.
Councilman Kazachi.
I just want to thank you for including the Sunshine Mile portion. It's really pre-positioned for adaptive reuse. Now we've got a project for public spaces in Rio involved, so thank you for that.
Okay, Councilmember Romero.
I just have a question on the map. And specifically on the Sunshine Mile portion and then on the Park Avenue portion, I was wondering actually why the map wouldn't be thinner along Broadway so that it covered less of the neighborhood, and then maybe got to the area of Campbell, which is the area that is going to be improved. And is there certain, I mean, there's certain concerns that neighborhoods will have the Jeeplet underneath them. So could you explain to us and give us some rationale?
Sure. Mr. Mayor, Councilor Romero, part of the issue is we'll call it the geometry, the configuration of it, so that we're not using we'll call it a relatively small strip. Although I think you bring up a great point as to go to Campbell, because that would make sense. But if you look at that, it would make it very narrow and look like a spider leg, if you will, coming out. And we thought that was not only of concern, but could violate the spirit and intent of the statute.
It also may not qualify under the Summer Blight the further east you go.
Yeah, and I think from a practical matter, obviously there'll be a notice logistics to it, but obviously these benefits are generally going to be used along the corridors, and having South Park in there is a great, a real good one.
Well, and I know that Councilmember Fibres has been working with the community, so I'd like to hear, in addition to the area of Broadway, which I don't know, Councilmember Kozaczek, I think you answered me and I didn't hear, the issue of bringing it all the way, making it thinner, but a little thinner, but bringing it all the way to Campbell. Was there any reason behind that?
Because
I mean, I know that we can't make like a thin connection. I know that they have to be in blocks and chunks, but is there a particular reason why so much of the area neighborhood in there?
Well, there is.
And it is not over to Campbell.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I can't answer exactly why not over to Campbell, but I do know that the further east you get, the more of a challenge you're going to get in terms of it simply qualifying under the terms of a G-Plat or the central business district. Which we're not calling it that. And so that's one answer. And secondly, it's in terms of residential remodeling, it's not going to apply anyway.
Okay.
Councilor Fembres.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to thank staff for the work, and I know we brought this back, and because my eyesight's not that good anymore, I just wanted to, is the location of the former Tucson Urban League campus located at 2305 South Park now located in the proposed map?
Mayor, Councilmember Fembres, it is.
And is the Millville Neighborhood Association located on the proposed map, what we had talked about?
Yes, it is.
And also the new one is the location of the new JTED campus located at Tucson Marketplace at the Bridges Park and west of Tucson Marketplace Drive, now part of this proposed map?
Yes, it is.
Thank you so much. That's really going to help that area develop.
Okay, anybody else on this topic? If not, I think we need a motion to, go ahead then.
One of the areas that we had talked about possibly also including was that piece of land, and I know that there's some history with some neighborhood work from I think we actually included, from 29th on the east side of the freeway up to 22nd. Is there a particular reason why that piece is not included?
Right here.
I think it abuts I-10.
Mr. Mayor, Councilor Romero, is that the area that's just, it's just south? Yeah, it's currently undeveloped ADOT land. Is that the one you're referring to?
That's why we're not including it? Okay.
Right?
No. That's the one you're referring to, that little piece there?
Okay, anything else? If not, I think we need a motion to direct the city attorney to come back with an ordinance. Is that accurate? Close enough?
So move.
Okay. Got a motion and a second. Any further discussion on this matter? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, thank you for that. This is going to be very helpful to the future. All right, let's move on then to item 8, which is the PAG report. We need a motion to endorse the recommendations of the PAG Executive Director. The Executive Director is here. The report looked relatively vanilla, but people could have questions. Councilmember Fimbres and then Councilmember Casati.
I'll make the motion to start the ball rolling to move on the recommendations.
Okay.
I don't know if there's a second yet.
Councilman Scott, okay. Okay. Questions?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, the one was, is the total nation involved in the Tier 1 EIS for the Sonoran Corridor? Have they been involved? I think they're a member of your group.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, council members, Fimbres, they are, and ADOT has been meeting with TO and all the other tribal governments for various reasons, but specifically with the TO because one of the options would have impacted their property.
Thank you.
Councilman Kozaczek?
The Highway Safety Improvement Program funds can go to pay for Hawks. Do you know what its status is, when the funding might become available, and when we might be able to start early design for next in line?
Yes, definitely. So that program used to be locally competitive for regional selection. Over the last couple of years, they've made it statewide selection. So we were able to work with everybody, put an application together. The application will be submitted here shortly. We're hoping we'll know by end of June, July timeframe. And obviously, once that's determined, we go through the IGA process and design and construction. So these are for fiscal years, I believe, 22 and 23.
Oh, okay.
So these are down the road, but it takes some time to actually get it programmed, get it into the tip, and then finally, hopefully, benefit from the design and construction.
Okay, so next question, this might be for either Mike Ortega or Jonathan or you. Has PAG taken a formal position in opposition to the I-11 alignment west of the Tucson Mountains?
So we have not. Obviously, again, that's a process that we typically allow ADOT to go through the whole corridor process study, go through the NEPA, and currently they're still collecting comments from the community. So we don't get involved until very late in the game.
But wouldn't our comments be important in terms of directing them to not pursue that alignment?
So again, individual communities have been consulted and they've submitted their comments, but PAG as a regional body, we don't get involved because we are part of the process at the end of the process, not this early in the process.
So, Councilman Kozaczek, I think hopefully everyone recalls the manager did send a letter to ADOT expressing our concerns, and I think, Mr. Manager, aren't you going to schedule them to come down here so that they can hear the concerns?
So, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, it's currently scheduled for the 18th of June. So at that point,
Will
the
that
council
still
will
be
have an
part
opportunity.
of the comment
Yes,
process?
yes.
Because
I think the comment process was, or the comment timeframe was delayed until, I believe, July 11th.
July 8th, I believe, is
July
the
8th.
deadline.
So we'll be finished in plenty of time for that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, anything else? If not, we've got a motion and a second. All in favor say aye. Aye, and opposed? All right, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Let's move on to, thank you, Farhad. Let's move on to item 9, which is the TP rate case, scheduled for 20 minutes. Time has been set aside for discussion regarding a request to file as an intervenor in the Tucson Electric Power rate case. I've got Michael Canizaro from our Conservation Office and Mr. Rankin.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, as the mayor just described, the purpose of this item is to seek the mayor and council's authorization to participate in the TEP rate case as an intervenor. And what that means is that we would formally file in the case as an intervenor. The city would be entitled to participate as a party. So we would get notice of all proceedings as the proceedings go on throughout the year. That we would have the ability to not just submit written comments, but we could put testimony in front of the ACC, ask questions of other witnesses, et cetera. So it's a higher level of participation than just submitting comments during comment period. One of the particular issues of interest to the city as one of TEP's largest customers, first of all, is there is a potential impact to the city with respect to the proposed rate increases. So we want to keep an eye on that and be able to report to the mayor and council what those financial impacts might be. But also, under ACC's prior rulings, when TEP comes forward with a rate case such as this, as part of that review, the ACC will also review TEP's alternative generation programs, including the buy-through tariff program. And that's a program under which certain customers can participate in a program by going out and securing power on the open market through negotiated rates, and then have that electricity, that power, distributed through the existing TEP system. It's kind of like a wheeling agreement in the water situation. Currently, under the program, the way it's set up, the city's not able to participate, even though we're one of the largest customers, because usage is measured by meter, by individual meters, as opposed to aggregating or aggregate net metering. So that's one of the issues we want to be heard on, to see if the city could become a participant in that program, potentially save the city money, as well as just give us more flexibility in terms of how we secure our energy.
Okay, Councilmember Cunningham.
So there's several things here. Number one is this just isn't an opportunity for the city to save revenue, because we have a lot of solar facilities. It's also an opportunity for our citizens to save. So more importantly, it's the Tucson City residents that we've facilitated as many incentives as we can. Number two, if there is my favorite person of all time, well, not my favorite person of all time, but one of my favorite people of all time is a guy named Trunk Candidate. And Trunk Candidate was quoted by saying, "Give me 6 inches of daylight and I'll make it happen." All we need is 6 inches of daylight. If you can find a way to intervene so we can fight this rate case, I'm totally good for that. I mean, I think you'll have the support of this entire council. From a strategy standpoint, I'd love to hear, I don't really want to tip our hand too much on what we're doing. If we do get to actually intervene on this, I'd really like to know what some of the strategies are and how we can help from a political side.
Okay, Councilman Romero.
I'd like to move that Mayor and Council authorize the city's participation in the pending TEP rate case as an intervener.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Before we go on, Councilman Ksachik, you're not crazy about Trunk Candidate, or what? He was pretty dang good.
Members wants to know where he was drafted to.
He's a all-time Wildcat.
No, in the pros.
Oh, where did he play?
St. Louis Rams.
All right.
Okay, now that we've got the important stuff out of the way.
All right. All right. So what is TEP's argument for not measuring our usage under an aggregated net basis? I mean, it just simply makes sense.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, I think it would be they would say it would probably be an administrative burden to stack all those accounts.
Yeah. So, and what is our, and this may not be fair questions for right now, but do you have a kind of a wag as to what our aggregate kilowatt usage is and what the 7.8% increase would cost us?
Mr. Mayor and members of council, our approximate usage per year is about 193 million kilowatt hours. The 7.8% increase would cost the city potentially in the neighborhood of over $1 million.
So this administrative burden for them is worth $1 million to us. That's really what we're saying.
Potentially.
Yeah. So if we did participate in the alternative, generation buy-through, what other providers are out there that we might be able to turn to and look for in terms of the?
Mr. Mayor, members of council, there's any number of providers.
So it's a bunch. We're not going
Absolutely.
to Joe's Bargain Electricity Shop down the road. These are major people,
Absolutely.
Major players. And I think Ray can answer this already. We're not really talking about changing providers. So there's a big capital investment in changing TEPs out. It's more just these are the rates, implement them as far as TEP goes.
Correct.
All right. Well, and also our material didn't give a date for intervening that I could see anywhere. What is that?
So we got this on the agenda because the ACC was preparing to issue scheduling orders, and which could include the deadline for intervening. There is an order that has been issued that sets some of the dates, including for intervener testimony in October and into November. I didn't see within that a deadline for filing as an intervener, but we will make sure we beat that deadline.
Okay, yeah. And finally, I don't know if this is the hand you didn't want to tip, Paul, but I think we ought to be tipping our hand and telling TEP we're going after this. We're going after it aggressively, and it's fair to us, it's fair to our ratepayers, and if there's a way that we could sit down with some of the people from our business services department and help them do that administrative lift and bundle our accounts together, then we'll do that for them. But it's worth $1 million to us.
I think they know that.
Yeah, well.
I was
that's-
talking about like strategy, never mind.
Well, there's no,
Mr. Mayor, just so the council is aware, I did reach out to TEP, let them know that you were addressing it, gave them a heads up. Also told them motivation is to go after this and for the reasons that have been discussed here. So it's pretty clear as to where we're going.
it's a fairness question is what it is.
Councilmember Durham.
Michael, would aggregate net metering allow us to significantly expand our power generated from solar?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Durham, absolutely. That's a possibility.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else on this? We've got a motion and a second. I think then let's go to a vote. All in favor say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? All right. Thank you. That's also very helpful. Let's move on to item 10, state and national legislative updates. Mr. Greenhill is approaching after a long drive back from Phoenix, I'm sure. Any state or national legislation or regional committee issues for discussion? Mr. Greenhill, how about if you, how are we doing on the budget?
On the budget?
As of 4/21.
You know, as of 4/21, Honorable Mayor, members of the council, I can tell you that the budget bills were just introduced within the last hour. So they're there. They've been first read, but there's still a long way to go. In short, Honorable Mayor, members of the council, I know that some budget documents were released yesterday. They've certainly gotten a lot of talk, and there are some things in there that are important to Mayor and Council that I've distributed to you. I've given you the information about them. Happy to review that. Mr. Mayor, would you like me to do that? Yes.
I've got your.
Well, that's for the bills.
Right.
So just real quick then on the budget. Just
Sure.
some highlights. State shared revenues are maintained. There's no threats to what we expect to receive on state shared revenues. Wayfair, which is the implementation of the collection of online sales tax from out-of-state vendors, that is included in some of the calculations, so they do expect to pass that. Tax conformity is included. That's a fancy word for a tax cut, unfortunately, and so that is included to the tune of about $300 million in the budget.
Mr.
This
Mayor.
was a priority to some of the, sorry.
It's funny, when you said that, my mic went off and Councilmember Ramirez went on.
You know, we've been hearing from the Red Fred movement throughout Arizona, and one of the things that they are advocating for is no tax cuts. And so is it a possibility to take a stand as a mayor and council against the proposed tax cuts that the budget has as of now, to make sure that we take a stand against them and then hopefully recommend that those go into public education funding? I mean, it's just it's going to be it's going to be something that the mayor and council can officially take a stand on.
Absolutely.
I'm not. Well, I mean, obviously it's a big discussion. I think advocating or taking a position against the tax cuts is a good one. We have a low tax rate in Arizona, particularly on income tax. I'm not as concerned. I mean, obviously, there's the Democratic caucus has a whole set of priorities. Part of it's more funding for education, but it's for other things too. And so I would just recommend that if we take the position, it's just not to support that cut and to work with the entire legislature to find appropriate places. There's going to be a rainy day fund.
Continued funding.
Yeah, there's going to be a rainy day fund. It's a question of what it's going to be, but if you have $300 million extra dollars, you might be able to spend a good chunk of it.
Right.
So
That's fine.
Okay, I think we're.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The DPS fee, as we've discussed in this proposed budget, is phased out over a 5-year period. As far as I could tell, it shouldn't affect our HERF revenues for next year, but in future years, that fee would be reduced and would have to be made up for somewhere else. There is an additional $8 million for cities in this budget for what they're calling infrastructure funding. It's not clear how that would be distributed, but those would be new dollars, presumably for transportation.
The budget has $10 million for the planning and design of a widening of I-10, one of the other bottlenecks that's between Tucson and Phoenix, in particular the 23 miles through the Gila River Indian community. There's $15 million for Pima Community College aviation program. I know that's been a priority of mayor and council to get the full $20 million that they need to double the school and the enrollment. Just so you know, I spoke to Pima Community College officials yesterday when I saw the $15 million figure. They're going to continue to pursue the extra $5 million or an equivalent amount some other way that would help them get to the $20 million that they're seeking.
Andrew, can they utilize the 15 million, or do they need an additional 5 million to implement their plans?
Honorable Mayor, members of the council, Councilmember Durham, they feel confident that they can get the additional money to do the plan that they intend. So they are they are seeking the full 20 million. They want to move ahead with the 20. When I asked them what that means if they only got 15, they said we're going to find the other money we need. So we'll continue to support them, of course. That's a mayor and council priority.
The governor's budget was for 20 million,
yes,
not 15.
The governor's budget was 20 million. Again, the documents that came out yesterday, they presumably reflect an agreement between the governor and the legislative leadership in the House and Senate. What's been happening since then, there's been a lot of discussion about whether indeed the votes are there for this budget. At this moment, I can tell you that they're not. So there could still be changes to this budget as it goes through the process. You know, these are just proposals. The House, the Senate have to come together on a budget that then is approved by the governor. So there still are opportunities to seek more funds. There is some money for the U of A. There's $9.4 million, a one-time increase for the U of A on top of their existing funding, and money for the expansion of the teachers' colleges. There's $165 million, which is the second part of the three-part 20 by 2020 commitment that the governor and the state legislature made last year as part of the Red for Ed movement last year. So the second piece of that is an additional 5% increase that's funded in this budget. There is an additional $136 million for district assistance funds. That's actually above what the governor put in his proposed budget. That's money that can go to school districts for transportation, textbooks, curriculum, and capital. There's money for SROs or school counselors, $15 million. And there is $10 million for the State Housing Trust Fund. That's not exactly what we were looking for with the low-income housing tax credit, but it is some money that will help advance the affordable housing cause across the state. Again, the process is just getting underway. The bills have been introduced. I'll be analyzing those this evening, but we'll continue to push for Mayor and Council's priorities through the budget process.
Okay, anybody else? Councilmember Fimbres?
Any movement on the HB 2547 horse racing simulcasting bill?
Sure, and that's a good segue actually to the chart I handed out, which I've updated for today based on what happened up to noon today. House Bill 2547 is one of those bills in yellow, meaning it hasn't been decided one way or the other yet. What's happened since I last reported to Mayor and Council on May 7th, the bill passed the State Senate. It passed 18-11. So now it goes back to the House. There were some issues, though, because while the bill as it stood was good for Riito and would have allowed them to have some off-track betting parlors in Pima County, there was another amendment added to the bill that seems to be helpful to Arizona Downs, the Prescott horse racing track, that apparently the Phoenix and Tucson tracks are a little uncomfortable with. So the bill in its current form, even with this extra amendment, would still allow Riito to do what it needs to do. But there may be some other legislative vehicles that may in fact come about that would help Riito get to the goal. So I continue to talk with the Riito folks as well as some of the other stakeholders on this. But where we stand today is the bill is back in the House. The House discussions are underway.
Andrew, clarify, the sports books are in that bill too?
sports books. So what the bill would do is it would, House Bill 2547, it would allow Rita Racetrack to provide simulcast video.
Well, I know that the off track is in there, but I thought that the sports books, you know, allowing people to lay money on games and stuff like that was part of that bill. Isn't that part of that bill? I mean, we're waiting on the enabling legislation for that. We know it's coming. I thought that was tied to the off track part.
I'm not sure about that. I'm sorry.
So the reality is it's all going to be tied. That's what this is all about. It's not about running horses. And by the way, dogs are still involved in this as well, both at Tucson Greyhound Park and Turf Paradise is going to run dogs on any of their parlors. But that's what this whole thing is about, is pre-positioning Turf Paradise to come into this community and do sports gambling in their bars. That's what it's about.
In the contrary to that, what Rito's trying to do is assure that they get.
They can do their own.
Well, I think it's now 6, right? They're looking at.
It was 6 by 2020, but it's also contingent on approval of this plus one more license for Turf Paradise, and the ability to continue to run dogs.
Okay, that's where they're at. So we'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So real quick then, on the chart that I've updated for you today, we had one win since the last meeting. House Bill 2570 moves into the green. That's the Study Committee for Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women. The governor signed that bill into law, and there is actually an appropriation in the budget, or the proposed budget, for staffing for that committee. So that was a bill mayor and council supported, and the governor indeed signed it. Other updates are just in bold, so just going down the list, House Bill 2047, that was the bill that provided extra money to cities and counties for HERF, for transportation, and as I alluded to earlier, the budget indeed has $18 million more for cities and counties for transportation. Moving down the list, House Bill 2547, I gave you an update on that. Senate Bill 1147, this is the tobacco vaping bill. No real movement on that since the last meeting. It did pass in the committee of the whole, but it has not gone to the House floor for a final vote yet. We're hopeful that the votes aren't there and we can defeat that bill. Skipping down then to the next bold, the $20 million for Pima Community College Aviation School. As I mentioned, there's 15 in the budget. We're seeking another 5. And then, unfortunately, there's a bill that we supported that the governor actually vetoed. That's House Bill 2473. That's the second to last bill on the list. This was a bill that passed the House unanimously, passed the Senate unanimously. It's a bill that would have added someone from the municipal sector to the state liquor board, which is something that many cities would like to see, someone who understands the effect of liquor licenses on community.
It passed through the state legislature 89-0.
Yes.
And the governor vetoed it. What was that?
Honorable Mayor, members of the council, in the governor's veto letter, what he said was that this adds an extra process or an extra step to the process, and he didn't feel like that was necessary. So we're disappointed with that veto. Yes.
He couldn't find money for the extra chair at the table in his rainy day fund.
It's a tight budget with a $900 million surplus.
So, Honorable Mayor, members of the council, with the budget now being released and there actually being bills introduced, we're hopeful that that starts the end game for the state legislative session. So we'll see how the bills that are still in yellow resolve themselves, as well as the budget itself. Happy to answer any questions.
Do you, if I may, Mr. Mayor, when is the end to this session?
Mayor, members of the council, Councilmember Romero, when people ask me when this session is going to end, I said, we're already a few weeks late, right? In the past couple of years, it's ended in that first week of May. So here we are, eyeing Memorial Day, and we're still not there yet. My guess is that the budget process, again, it can be clean, it could be messy. I'm guessing at least another week for the resolution of the budget and other bills, but there's no, there really is no saying for sure. As I mentioned before, there are some members that have announced that they have commitments outside the legislature that will take them out of state, and in certain cases out of the country. So I think there is a desire, an eagerness to finalize things as soon as possible.
So 24-hour sessions?
All-night debates on the floor.
Right.
We've seen those before.
How likely is it that those tax cuts would pass?
Honorable Mayor, members of the council, Councilman Romero, I think that the fact that they came out as part of the agreed-upon budget suggests that the majority caucus wants to see it and expects to see it. There is one state senator, Senator Mesnard, who has said publicly since this was released that it actually doesn't meet his goal. He wants to see not necessarily additional tax cuts, but he'd like to see them structured a little differently. So there are some conservative members who would like to see this and see it happen more robustly and even more quickly. Along those same lines, there is a Republican state senator who would like to see the DPS fee phased out over 2 years instead of 5 years, which would be a very rapid decline in monies that we're hoping to be available for her.
And weren't there a couple members of the majority caucus who were holding out over the statute of limitations on child abuse cases? Is that still in play?
Yes. Honorable Mayor, members of the council, there have been some statements by other legislators who have bills of importance to them that they've said they would withhold their votes on the budget if their bills would not be resolved in their favor. One of those bills is one that the mayor described. It has to do with the statute of limitations to file civil cases in child sexual assault. Senator Boyer, Senator Carter have said that they will withhold their votes on the budget unless that change is made in state law this session. Okay. So that's another wrench in the works.
Councilmember Fimbres.
This pertains to national and federal. I think many of my colleagues have received this from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection regarding the proposed Pima and Cochise County's border infrastructure projects. And I know as a council we've taken ahead. I'm wondering if we can have council respond to this, also showing him the letter that we did send an opposition and how it's going to impact us economically. Mm-hmm. And environmentally, how it's going to impact our habitat. So can you do that? Do we need a motion or just to go ahead and do it?
Is this on the Oregon pipe?
This is on the Cochise County border infrastructure projects that they're talking about, the wall, basically.
And also the Oregon pipe wall.
Okay. You're just looking essentially for a reiteration of what we've done, but make it specifically respond to this
I would respond to this letter, just letting us know.
We can do that. It's not changing our position.
So we don't need a motion?
I don't believe so.
Can I give this to you and then? Sure.
Thank you for bringing it up, Councilmember Fimbres.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else? All right. If not, item 11 is items to remove from the consent agenda. Are there any? Councilmember Durham? All right. Okay. I think we can take that up this evening. Durham's intent to continue the public hearing on item 8, and I know there were some people interested in coming and appearing tonight. Hopefully they've all been communicated with. And, okay. All right. Then, so nothing to take off consent. Anything for future agendas? We've just got a bulletin.
I just wanted to include to set aside 30 minutes during the June 18th Mayor and Council study session to discuss issues of displacement. And this is a memo signed by Councilmember Fimbres, Councilmember Kozaczek, and myself. And this is for June 18th.
Okay, so let me get some clarification, because we were showing as a placeholder for June 4th. I think we had called it gentrification. This is that same matter, but to move it to the 18th.
This is the same matter as gentrification and displacement issues.
Okay, we got it.
But just to make sure that we have appropriate amount of time for staff and the city manager to prepare, and if they need to reach out to any, I know there's a coalition of barrios that gets together. I'm sure that Keith Gregory and the city manager might want to get that outside input as well.
We got it. Thank you. All right. Anything else? If not,
Mr. Mayor, I'm going to send a memo forward regarding a study session on opportunity zones. I think we just updated the proposed CBD expansion area, but I think we also need to look at opportunity zones and how it impacts and where they're at.
Sure.
For 20 minutes.
Okay, well, just get us the memo and we'll get it on. Councilman Kozaczek.
With respect to what Rainey was just talking about on this memo, earlier today I didn't have a chance to digest it all, but an email came out that had 25 suggestions for addressing the issue of displacement, and part of the memo is to ask staff to look into options. So if you could review that. I read it quickly, and some of it I'd never heard of, frankly. So, some of it might make sense, some of it might not. So.
And also there is an Austin study and a list of recommendations that the city of Austin put forward. I know that this Barrio Coalition has been disseminating that information as well. It would be really nice to include that when we're putting together the item, because that is a report that has been quoted by this coalition.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, then, we will adjourn until 5:30. Thank you.